This video is brought to you by Brilliant. For lots of young adults, living with your parents might sound like a nightmare. But in the EU, it's more common than you might think, with nearly half of 18 to 34-year-olds in Europe still living in the family home. And that fraction is apparently increasing over time. So in this video, we'll try and figure out why so many young adults in Europe still live at home. Hint, it might have something to do with the EU's housing crisis, and what this trend means for Europe. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. So let's start by just looking at the numbers. According to the latest Eurostat data, an estimated 49.4% of 18 to 34-year-olds in Europe live in their parents' home, compared with just over 1 in 3 in the US, and just below 40% in the UK. The highest rates are in Croatia, Greece, Portugal, Italy, Slovakia and Spain, where adults are also typically much older before moving out. While the average European leaves the family home at 26.4 years old, average ages of above 30 are common in Croatia, Slovakia, Greece, Bulgaria, Spain, Malta and Italy. By contrast, in Finland, Sweden and Denmark, as well as Estonia, people tend to leave home in their early 20s. In all EU countries, women also fly the nest earlier than men on average, at 25.4 years compared to 27.3. It's not just that Europeans are staying at home longer than their American and British peers, but also that the average age at which Europeans move out is steadily going up, with 14 EU countries experiencing an increase in the average age to leave the family home over the last decade. So why is this? The first and most obvious reason is the EU-wide housing crisis has made it much more difficult for young people today to afford a place of their own. Between 2010 and 2022, average house prices in the EU increased by 47%, and average rents went up 19%. Crucially, rents and property prices have shot up much faster than income over the last few decades, meaning young people have to wait much longer to get on the housing ladder compared to their parents. This is especially true for urban areas, where young people generally want to live, and for young people's incomes, which have risen especially slowly since the financial crisis, in large part because university degrees aren't as valuable as they used to be. Now, the precise causes of the housing crisis are disputed, and vary depending on what country you're looking at, but super low interest rates, restrictive planning laws, and rising construction costs have all undeniably played a part. You might have thought that rising interest rates last year might have brought property prices back down, but unfortunately for young people, European property prices have held up relatively well, and it seems that higher interest rates have actually increased rent costs by discouraging would-be first-time buyers, who've entered the rental market instead of taking out a high-interest mortgage. Another reason why young Europeans are living at home is high youth unemployment. Unsurprisingly, there's a strong correlation between youth unemployment and the percentage of adults living at home. Spain, Greece, Italy and Croatia, for example, all have some of the highest rates of both youth unemployment and adults still living at home. In Spain and Greece, over 10% of 15 to 29-year-olds are unemployed, followed by Italy at 7.4% and Croatia at 7.1%. While there are some exceptions, Poland, for example, has low youth unemployment but high percentage of adults living at home, while Sweden has high youth unemployment but few adults living at home, in general, youth unemployment means more young adults living at home, for the simple reason that unemployed people can't afford expensive housing. For many young people living at home in an area without many job opportunities, this creates a sort of employment impasse, because they can't afford to move somewhere with a well-paying job, but they can't get a job in their current area. The final economic reason worth mentioning is the ongoing cost of living crisis. Global inflation has driven prices up, and the war in Ukraine also caused a spike in energy costs across Europe in 2022. While inflation has come down, that doesn't mean that prices have actually come down. Rather, the rate at which they're increasing has decreased, and they're still at least as high as they were during the peak of last year's crisis. To make matters worse, the European Central Bank has now raised interest rates to the highest level since the launch of the euro. While inflation has duly come down, higher interest rates have stunted the European economy and made mortgages super unaffordable, especially because house prices have held up relatively well. As a result, some young homeowners have gone back to renting or moved back with their parents, as the high cost of borrowing just isn't worth it for a mortgage. Lastly, there are other crucial and societal reasons why young adults might choose to live with their parents. General attitudes seem to be shifting, and living with your parents throughout early adulthood isn't quite as stigmatised as it used to be. A widespread acknowledgement of rising costs, wage stagnation and housing shortages mean people are much more sympathetic to millennials and Gen Zers, who can't afford a place of their own. It's also worth noting, as people get married and start having families later in life, there's less pressure to move out as soon as possible. So what does all this mean for the future? Well, it's hard to say if it's a good or a bad thing. Some people think it's a bad thing because it makes young people less independent and makes the economy less dynamic. They also point out that people who live at home are, for obvious reasons, less likely to have children, which could exacerbate Europe's demographic crisis. Other people think it's a good thing because this should reduce demand for housing, which might eventually bring down prices, while simultaneously providing young people with a bit more disposable income, which would otherwise be eaten up by housing costs. Proponents of living at home also point out that, as Europe ages, it might be good to have families living together, so young people can at least partly take care of their ageing relatives. But it's worth remembering these apparent advantages are only really partial solutions to pre-existing problems, namely Europe's housing crisis and its demographic crisis. And perhaps the best outcome here would be if this trend forced governments to pay more attention to solving these crises. As we step into 2024, many of us are contemplating our New Year's resolutions, always looking to improve ourselves and learn more about the world around us. And while our content is always a good starting point, a lot of stuff we talk about can seem pretty complicated, especially when we dive into analytics and detailed data. But luckily there's a fun and easy way to learn more, which also doesn't cost thousands of dollars or take years and years of schooling. That's because Brilliant is the best way to learn maths, data science and computer science interactively. And the good thing is, it doesn't take long to learn either. These complex topics are broken down into small but accessible chunks, designed around your busy schedule. Even just a few minutes a day can help you with accumulating new knowledge over time in a fun and engaging way. As time goes on, you'll also get used to that empowering feeling of learning too, because Brilliant isn't just about memorization and lectures. Brilliant teaches you by doing, using active learning techniques to teach you the principles behind otherwise quite complex subjects, and ensuring you actually understand what's going on. So whether you want to brush up on your basic maths skills, improve your employment prospects, or just have another New Year's resolution for 2024, you can check out everything Brilliant has to offer free for a full 30 days by going to brilliant.org/TLDR. Plus, the first 200 of you will get 20% off Brilliant's annual premium subscription. Thanks for your support. Shouldn't be a crisis, should just build some more houses. Stick that at the end of the video.